Intelligent design is the idea that there are certain features of life and the universe that are best explained by reference to a designing intelligence or mind, rather than by reference to undirected material processes. For example, the process of natural selection, if you're operating in the biological realm.
We don't have time. Even if evolution started, even if the universe started 13 billion years ago, we just didn't have enough time. So this is one thing which is empirically. It's like, just trying to find the needle in a giant bomb.
So whenever we see information of that kind, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book, or information embedded in a radio signal, or even the information that's produced by, say, an RNA simulation experiment in origin of life research, even the tiny bits of information that can be generated in the laboratory in these origin of life experiments are always generated by a mind, just as the information in computer code is generated by a mind, or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book. All these different examples we have where we see information that's functionally specified, and we trace that information back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process.
Ever since the Enlightenment, it seems that there is an inherent conflict between God and science. If you also think so, this video is precisely for you. In this conversation, I had the privilege of speaking with Dr. Stephen Meyer. Stephen got his PhD from Cambridge University in the history and philosophy of science. He published several exceptional books, including Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt. David Galanter, the famous computer scientist from Yale University, wrote about that book, Darwin's Doubt. Stephen Meyer's thoughtful and meticulous book convinced me that Darwin has failed. His latest book is The Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. It was a mind-blowing conversation. By the way, in my opinion, many people confused between creationism and intelligent design. And this is the source of many mistakes conducted in the field. Steve has a great distinction between them. Hi and welcome to my channel. My name is Dr. Roi Yozevitch. In this channel, I speak and converse with the most interesting and influential people from all around the world, discussing science, philosophy, religion, artificial intelligence, and more. If you like this video, please consider subscribing, hit the bell button, and be part of this great community. And now, without further ado, Stephen C. Meyer.
Steve Meyer, the author of The Return of the God Hypothesis. Thank you so much for coming. How are you this morning?
I'm doing very well. And the evening for you, yes, halfway around the world.
So we definitely, this is just halfway around the world. So we have in the background The Return of the God Hypothesis, very small, and much bigger Signature in the Cell. And we have also Darwin Doubts, which I can't see right now. Okay.
Yes,
but nevertheless, before we start with the book itself and its argument, I think it is very important to define the terms. And before we delve into the argument in the book, one should define the terms. Now, when we say God, I can think of at least 2 very different concepts. One is the God of Aristotle, the unmoved mover, but we also have the Hebrew or the Christian God, someone, not something, that has moral demands from humanity. And 40 years ago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn delivered his Men Have Forgotten God speech, where he said, and let me quote, "While I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of older people offer the following explanation for the great disaster that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. This is why all this had happened." And it seems that Mr. Solzhenitsyn refers to the moral God. So my first question is, what God are we talking about?
I'm talking about not the unmoved mover of Aristotle, but the God a God who can be defined by reference to attributes that match those of the moral God, a transcendent, intelligent, personal, and being who is also active in the creation. This is what I think can be discerned from a careful examination of the creation, or of the evidence that we have about biological, physical, and cosmological origins.
And you say that I can see that we have like the intelligent thing, like in the evolution. I teach genetic algorithms, and if we want to apply genetic algorithms in computers, we need something from the future to pull the process to the desired outcome. So this is one thing that I can understand. In genetic algorithm, you need to do, or evolution must be local, it can't be global, and genetic algorithms must be global. But this is not the kind of thing that has moral demands. So again, we say two things. One is the intelligent thing, the one, that pulls the evolution. One can say this, and the other is the one with the moral demands. Is it fair to say?
You've introduced the term the moral God. I would simply argue that the evidence from the natural world supports the existence of a personal God, in the sense that intelligence or mind is a necessary attribute of that entity which is necessary to explain the evidence from the natural world concerning its origins, concerning the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, and life. So we're not simply talking about the abstract notion of we're not talking about intelligent simpliciter. And so in a sense, it'd be maybe better for me to develop the thesis on my own terms without trying to fit into those two categories. But I think what you have are attributes of my, let me back up. My first two books, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, argued that the evidence that we have in the biological realm, in particular of the digital code that's present in the DNA molecule and the hierarchical information processing system that's present in living cells and living animals, is best explained by a designing mind of some kind. I'll also address genetic algorithms and show that even those simulations of evolution require very important inputs of information coming always from an intelligent agent, and also always an end-directed aspect to them, as you've just described. That's very contrary to the way natural selection works. Natural selection selects for a functional advantage. It can't foresee future functional requirements. And yet genetic algorithms require that sort of foresight, which is inconsistent with the way natural selection is supposed to work. And therefore, they actually, I argued, simulate the need for intelligence in the process of biological origins, if they simulate anything. So after the first two books, in which I argued for the need for some sort of intelligence or mind to account for the information-bearing properties of life, just to say as a shorthand, many of my readers wanted to know, well, who do you think the intelligence is? Or what is the identity of in designing intelligence, and what can we tell about such a being from science? And so I broadened the scope of the inquiry to include the origin of the universe and the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe, and argued that whereas some biologists, including even the great Francis Crick, had proposed at one point or another that perhaps there was design in living systems, but it would have come from an alien intelligence within the cosmos, an immanent intelligence, a space alien. This was his famed panspermia hypothesis, which he later disclaimed out of, I think, embarrassment. But there have been scientists who have said, well, yeah, there is evidence of design, but maybe it's come from an immanent intelligence within the cosmos. By bringing in the evidence we have from cosmology and physics of a definite beginning of the universe, and a universe that has been finely tuned for life from the beginning, I argued that no intelligence that's merely immanent within the cosmos could account for the whole range of evidence that we have about biological and cosmological origins. The universe had a beginning. It's been fine-tuned from the beginning. And since the beginning, we've had large bursts or infusions or increases in the information content of our biosphere, suggesting the activity of a designing intelligence after the beginning. So as I then looked at the different metaphysical hypotheses, whether we were talking about panspermia or deism or pantheism or materialism, it was really only classical theism that could provide an adequate explanation for these three classes of evidence. We need to posit a designing intelligence that is not just intelligent, but also transcendent in the sense of being separate from the creation. No being within the cosmos could account for the origin of the fine-tuning upon which its later evolution would depend, nor could any being within the cosmos account for the origin of the cosmos itself. It would to account for those classes of evidence that have come out of modern science. We need to posit a mind which is in some way separate or transcendent over, or separate from or transcendent over the creation, the universe as a whole. And so that, I think, leads you to classical theism. I don't, in this book, argue for moral attributes for that agent, but I think there is a very strong argument for theism from the reality of moral propositions that I don't think can be accounted for, in the objectivity of which I don't think can be accounted for apart from a transcendent valuer as the source of those moral propositions. So I think there are strong arguments for classical theism, including the moral attributes of God, but I focus on those attributes which I think can be known from the natural world in this particular book.
Okay, you said
I hope
many wonderful
helps.
things.
Yeah,
so many wonderful things, and I just keep wondering, how should I navigate this? And I wanted to do like a slight midturn into signature in the cell, but I will not do it. I will not do it. I want to go in the original direction, okay? And I think that we will come to signature in the cell, which is a great argument later on, okay? One thing, when I read your Wikipedia page, you say, Stephen C. Meyer is an American author and a former educator, is an advocate of the pseudoscience of intelligent design. And this is why we have pseudoscience in Wikipedia. And in a conversation you had with Ben Shapiro, you made a great distinction between what is creationism and intelligent design. What is the source of knowledge? And I think this is a very important distinction to make. So could you please elaborate on the distinction between creationism and intelligent design? Let me just say that in Israel, even though I'm an ultra-Orthodox, the concept creationism as being understood in the US is barely visible here. Almost no one believes in that the world was created as in the first chapter of Genesis. Almost no one. So, like in what Michelangelo painted in the Sistine Chapel. So we don't know, or I am not familiar with any creationist, but I'm familiar with many intelligent designers. So if you can please set the terms.
Yeah, well, intelligent design is the idea that there are certain features of life and the universe that are best explained by reference to a designing intelligence or mind, rather than by reference to undirected material processes. For example, the process of natural selection, if you're operating in the biological realm, which is not to say we deny that natural selection is a real process, but we think there are features that require reference to a mind or intelligence to account for their origin. Creationism is, and intelligent design differs from creationism in two very significant and important ways. First of all, intelligent design is an inference from biological or cosmological data, whereas creationism is a deduction from religious authority, a deduction or an interpretation of a religious authority, typically the first chapters of Genesis. Secondly, creationists typically affirm that the universe and planet Earth are very young, on the order of thousands of years. Typically, those dates are derived from some sort of calculation from the genealogies in the book of Genesis. Whereas intelligent design is an age-neutral theory, which is concerned about the question of whether life, in particular, is the product of actual design or merely manifests the appearance of design, for example, as the neo-Darwinists say. So it has a different its focus of interest is entirely different. Most proponents of intelligent design, most prominent proponents at least, hold to an ancient Earth and an ancient universe, that we accept the standard dating system of modern science. There are, of course, young Earth creationists who would also accept that there is evidence of intelligent design, but not all proponents of intelligent design are young Earth creationists by any means, though if you're a young Earth creationist, you pretty much also must accept that there's evidence of design in the universe. So that's a convergence that's unavoidable.
And
so there's both an epistemological difference. We're looking at the evidence of the natural world and making an inference rather than starting from biblical authority. And then there's a substantive difference in content of the theory, in that ID has intelligent design does not affirm a young Earth or young universe.
And again, I think the most important thing, or the most important distinction, in my opinion, is the ultimate authority. You go to the ultimate authority as the scientific method and say, okay, I read the data, I search for explanations. Some explanations are not strong enough in the context of the material world or pure materialism. Hence, I seek explanations in other domains, or but my ultimate source, or my ultimate hierarchy of knowledge, is the scientific method. It's not chapter 1 of Genesis. I think it's very important. Yes?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Although when a couple qualifications even in that short statement, and that is that the first is that as a philosopher of science, I think there is more than one scientific method, and the scientific method that's relevant to an examination of origins is an historical scientific method, the very method that Darwin championed in The Origin of Species, based on work that had previously been done by, for example, the great geologist Charles Lyell, who I think pioneered a distinctively historical method of scientific investigation. And so we're using that scientific method. And also when I infer intelligent design, I'm quite prepared to defend that as a scientific inference, because we have scientific methods for detecting the activity of intelligence. When I go further in this most recent book and address questions of the identity of the designer, I'm quite happy to call my God hypothesis, if you will, a metaphysical hypothesis. It happens, though, that there isn't a clear distinction, I think, between scientific and metaphysical reasoning, that we use the same types of methods of evaluating competing hypotheses to assess both scientific theories and theories with metaphysical implications. And so I'm not a strict proponent of the demarcation between science and philosophy, or even science and a religious hypothesis. I think we use the same kinds of methods of reasoning to address both proximate questions about the natural world that are by convention termed scientific, and deeper questions about ultimate reality that would be by convention termed metaphysical. And that, I think, brings us back to that designation of me in in Wikipedia as a pseudoscientist, because they are employing a demarcation between science and philosophy or metaphysics in that designation. I think it's actually mainly a term of abuse, or a term by which people can be stigmatized without engaging an argument. But it also presupposes that there is a definition of science that has been widely accepted by scientists and philosophers that can define science normatively and distinguish it from other disreputable forms of inquiry that the writers of Wikipedia entries would prefer not to engage. But this whole issue of demarcation, or defining science normatively in a way that allows someone to exclude from consideration an idea that they'd rather not consider, has really fallen into disrepute, especially among philosophers of science. If people are familiar with the work of Larry Loudon, for example, a great American philosopher of science, he says people simply don't use the idea of pseudoscience anymore. It's fallen into demarcation as an enterprise has fallen into disrepute, and therefore terms like pseudoscientists are usually just used as shorthands for trying to eliminate or from consideration an idea that people would prefer not to think about. So we've had numerous people try to correct that on Wikipedia.
Okay, no. Steve,
always gets corrected. Always gets reverted. Yeah.
I had Rupert Sheldrake on the show, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I really know exactly what you're talking about. Now, regarding intelligent design, the idea that you come from the scientific method and then you deduce something about God is very elaborated in your book signature in The Cell. The gist, I think, is rather simple, but it is mind-blowing. If you look at the DNA sequence, which is AGCT, AAGCT, what you have here is there is nothing that permit or forbid A to be after C or after D. The only thing that matter is the sequence. The sequence is what creates everything. If the sequence, the information is coded in the sequence, and if it is coded in the sequence, there must be something or someone which coded it into the system. And I think that this is the mind-blowing argument. This is just a mind-blowing argument. So if you can please, one, elaborate on what I just said, if I didn't make a big mistake. And two, since it is so mind-blowing, what is the traditional materialistic view of this very phenomenon?
Right. Well, a little background here. The argument that I developed is based on extremely mainstream molecular biology, and it goes back to the discoveries first in the 1950s. Watson and Crick elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule, the famed double helix. Then in 1957, Francis Crick, working on his own, formulates what he calls the sequence hypothesis, the idea that the function of the DNA molecule, or stretches of the DNA molecule that we now call genes, that the function of the DNA molecule does not depend on the physical properties of the subunits of the DNA, the so-called nucleotide bases, or bases that run along the interior of the spine of the molecule, but rather it depends on the arrangement or sequence of those subunits in accord with an independent symbol convention, which is later discovered and elucidated and now is known as the genetic code. So what comes out of the molecular biological revolution in the late 50s and early 1960s is the realization that DNA is a true information carrying molecule, that you have genetic text that is converted and interpreted by a genetic code, and that information is being used to direct the construction of the protein molecules that perform all the important jobs in the cell. So you have a property, DNA has a property that's been variously called sequence specificity, or specified complexity, or specified or functional information. It is a great biotech worker here in our Seattle area, Leroy Hood, simply says DNA contains digital code. Richard Dawkins acknowledges that it's like a machine code. Bill Gates says it's computer, like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. So this discovery ends up changing the terms of debate among those who are trying to explain the origin of life. Because if you want to try to explain the origin of the very first cell, you have to account for life as we find it. And so instead of just a concern about explaining the origin of the chemistry at work inside the cell, researchers working on origin of life biology, which is what I did my PhD on, realize that they've got to account for the information inside living systems, inside DNA and RNA, and indeed even proteins, I think can be considered information-bearing molecules. And so various approaches arose in the late 1960s and 70s and right to the present to try to account for that information. Some were initially just invoking chance, but the extreme improbability of getting all those digital or alphabetic characters that are stored in the DNA molecule. I mean, they're functioning like digital or alphabetic characters, the nucleotide bases, led most researchers, I think, by the early 70s to reject the chance hypothesis. And I go into the details of the quantitative reasoning that's involved in that in the book, but it's not a live approach. The other approach was to invoke a natural selection at a prebiotic level, or a prebiotic in a prebiotic environment. But the problem with that is that natural selection depends upon self-replication, and self-replication in turn requires information-rich DNA and protein molecules. So it ends up begging the question of the very thing it is meant to explain. Or begging the question as to the origin of the very thing it's meant to explain. There's been a revival of that approach in something called the RNA world, but the RNA hypothesis also, just to get a self-replicating RNA molecule, requires an intense or a very large amount of information, of sequence specificity in an original RNA, and so it doesn't really circumvent or solve the information problem. And then a third approach is something called self-organizational scenarios, where where scientists were invoking differential bonding properties. The idea was that the A, C's, G's, and T's in the DNA, or the amino acids in the proteins, were lining up in a specific way because there were chemical forces of attraction between the constituent parts of those large biomolecules that forced them to align in that way. It turned out experimentally that simply wasn't the case. And in the DNA, it's actually quite easy to see this. If you look at the structural formula of the molecule, there are no bonding properties between the information-bearing parts of the DNA. There are bonds that cause the informational characters, the nucleotides, to stick to the sugar phosphate backbone, which is the medium of the message, but there are no bonds along the axis that carries the information between the bases. And so it's just simply not the case that there are physical chemical forces of attraction that determine the sequencing of the characters. This was first recognized by the great...
Just a second.
Yeah.
What you just say, that this is if we look at the sequence for AGCT, this is not a jigsaw puzzle where, okay, I have this piece and this piece must fit in. This is not
right.
a jigsaw. This is just a sequence of a sequence of digital numbers representing something else, which means that it is not the biology or the chemistry that stitches two amino acids together. This is where the signatures, the information comes from. Say, how is it possible?
Yeah, very well explained. Although at the very end you said amino acids, it's not the. I'm sorry. It's not the chemistry that causes the information-bearing nucleotide bases to stick together. I use an illustration with students of I don't know if you have these in Hebrew, but we have little magnetic letters in English letters with magnets on the inside, and we can stick them on a metallic surface like a refrigerator and then spell a message. And the illustration is that there are, just as there are magnetic letters that stick the message to the medium on that refrigerator, in DNA, there are forces of attraction that account for why the nucleotide bases that are carrying the message stick to the backbone of the molecule. But there are no, just as in the case of the magnetic letters, the magnetic force does not determine the arrangement of the letters. The physical chemical forces in DNA do not determine the arrangement of the nucleotide bases. And this was first recognized by the great Hungarian physical chemist Michael Polanyi, who wrote two technical articles in the late 60s, one called Life's Irreducible Structure and another called Life Transcending Physics and Chemistry. And his point was the information that's necessary to produce life is not determined by the chemistry that holds the DNA molecule together. There's something else. He argues it must have an exogenous source, something beyond the chemistry must be responsible. And so those three,
what can be beyond the chemistry? Yeah. I had a great talk with Michael Levine about the bioelectricity, but again, what he said is just science fiction, and it goes back to the question: who codes?
Right. Where do you get the code? And my argument. So my argument can be summarized in the following way: it's an inference to the best explanation, and where the best explanation is the activity of a mind or an agent or an intelligence. And what I do in Signature in the Cell is I look at, as I just described, the materialistic explanations that are either based on chance or physical chemical necessity, which is what these self-organizational models are, or some combination of the two. The great molecular biologist Jacques Monod wrote the famed book Chance and Necessity, and his argument is that scientists must explain things, or typically do explain things, by reference to chance, necessity, or in a Darwinian style explanation, some combination of the two. Mm-hmm. I show that all three of those approaches are empirically inadequate and also inherently inadequate for theoretical reasons. And so I say, well, is there any other type of cause of which
just a second again? So it's not just we have like a monkey on a million typewriters says to be or not to be, okay, which is like the very famous example. I think David Berlinski loved this example. Mm-hmm. And when we look at the searching space, okay, that spans when we do it, and let alone the searching space of 3 billion AGCT, this is just cannot be done. We don't have time. Even if evolution started, even if the universe started 13 billion years ago, we just didn't have enough time. So this is one thing which is empirically. It's like, just trying to find the needle in a giant bomb. But then you add, I'm saying not only, but from a theoretical point of view, it can be done. Because something, again, needs to pull it. Something needs to put the information. It can't be that out of chance something like this just happened. Because when we have like a mutation, I had this talk with Michael Levine. When we have mutation, in most of the times it will decrease the operation of the living organism. Okay, mutation will ruin.
Well, and this is mutations don't really come into play in getting the information necessary to get life going in the first place. You need something prior to the mutation selection mechanism that can account for the origin of the first information-bearing molecules. And so there are chance-based, or there were chance-based theories of the origin of life really only through the 1950s. I mean, once the molecular biology became apparent, people abandoned that approach. When we're critiquing chance now, I go into a very rigorous kind of probabilistic argument about this. And it's not simply that things are improbable, but rather that the DNA and protein molecules, of RNA molecules, the information-bearing molecules, are improbable relative to the number of opportunities that would exist in the best case given a 14 billion year old universe, considering all the possible interactions that might occur between elementary particles. It's a second order probabilistic analysis where you analyze the probability of the event in relation to the number of opportunities there are. And your needle in the haystack illustration is apt because it's the search space is just too large in relation to the number of opportunities. And so it becomes more probable than not that the chance hypothesis, it becomes the chance, finding the information in the available time given the maximum number of available trials ensures that you can, sorry, it's difficult to explain this quickly. The number of trials available ensure that you will only search a tiny portion of the search space, and therefore the chance hypothesis is more likely to be false than true. It's more likely that a chance search will fail rather than succeed, and therefore the hypothesis that that's how it happened is overwhelmingly more likely to be false than true. And on that ground, on that basis, you have very strong grounds for rejecting it. But in the book, I show that I don't just look at the materialistic hypotheses based on chance. I also look at those based on physical chemical necessity and those that try to combine physical chemical necessity with some sort of random or chance process. And then after all that, I say, is there, since all of those are inadequate, is there another type of cause that is known to produce the effect in question? And the effect in question being the kind of information that we find in DNA, RNA, and proteins. And I argue that there is such a cause. That cause is intelligence or mind. And I infer that or consider that not based on just the failure of the materialistic explanations, but based on our knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world, that we see many, many instances of minds producing the kinds of information that we need to explain the origin of life. So we have positive knowledge of the causal power of intelligence with respect to the thing we're trying to explain. So this is not an argument from ignorance or a God of the gaps argument. It's rather what philosophers of science call an inference to the best explanation, which is, by the way, the use of that method is exactly the same method that Darwin used in The Origin of Species. So here's the argument in short. Whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, and I define information very carefully as functional or specified information, where the arrangement of the characters is specified to perform a given independent function. So whenever we see information of that kind, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal, or even the information that's produced by, say, an RNA simulation experiment in origin of life research, even the tiny bits of information that can be generated in the laboratory in these origin of life experiments are always generated by a mind, just as the information in computer code is generated by a mind, or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book. All these different examples we have where we see information that's functionally specified, and we trace that information back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. A computer program requires a programmer, for example. And therefore, when we find information in the DNA molecule that has that is functionally specified, that constitutes a sequence-specific, functionally specified string of information, we can infer that that information arose from an intelligent agent, not an undirected process. This is the inference that I draw and the argument that I make. So I look at 4 different possible types of causes for the origin of the information in DNA and argue that mind or intelligence provides the best explanation for the origin of that information based on our uniform and repeated experience of what it takes to generate information in all the observations that we've made of the world around us.
Okay, so I must now, I think, stop and ask you, what you say, whenever we see in our universe information, it means that someone coded it. If we trace it backwards, we have a mind. My question is, I have 2 questions. One is, how does it differ, if it does, from the clockwork argument? If you see a clock, someone built the clock, okay? So how does it differ from this traditional argument?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Yeah, that's a very important question. I think the clockwork argument probably has been undersold, because the claims that it was refuted by Darwin, I think, are looking a little thin, because Darwinism is in such trouble.
Famous. He made it famous.
Yes, right, he did. But there is a very important distinction or difference I think, in the rigor of the argument that we've developed for intelligent design versus the Paley argument from 1802. Paley argued in a strictly analogical manner. He said that clocks are like organisms, or watches are like organisms. We know that organisms came from an intelligent cause. Or sorry, we know that watches came from watchmakers, therefore the organism must have come from an intelligence. But strictly analogical arguments depend on the degree of similarity between the effect and the two effects in question. And those who attempted to refute Paley, it was claimed that Hume refuted Paley, but Hume died before Paley wrote his argument. But in any case, Humeans have attempted to refute the argument by pointing out that, in addition to similarities between mechanisms and organisms, there are also differences, and the Paley argument doesn't really account for those differences, and therefore it can't provide a really precise measure of the degree of similarity between the two things that are in need of explanation. And if there isn't a precise way of assessing those degrees of similarity, it's impossible to know how reliable the inference to a similar cause is in the case of the inference to intelligent design for organisms.
So I can have, just a second, so I can have, with your permission, a modified argument for the Paley argument, an ordered universe, and I think everyone who studies physics or chemistry or biology knows that we have an ordered universe, must imply someone who order it or make the arrangement. Like if say that says that your room is perfectly neat, someone did it. Okay, so it's not just an organism. We see the universe as an order structure. We have the laws of nature, the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, etc. Hence, someone is responsible for it. So how does this modified argument differ from the intelligence? There is intelligence in the DNA sequence, therefore someone coded it.
Well, with the tools of modern information sciences, information theory, and other forms of analysis of the qualitative features of living organisms, we're able to much more precisely characterize the effect in question, the effect that most needs explanation. And that effect is not simple order. It's not that watches are like organisms in that they're both complex, but rather that there is a very specific property present in the DNA, attribute. There's a very specific attribute of DNA and RNA and proteins, and that is what origin of life scientists and information scientists have called specified complexity, or specified information in the sense of a sequence of characters that are arranged precisely to perform an overall function. And when we find that property in our experience, it always arises from an intelligent agent. And therefore, the presence of that property in DNA and RNA and proteins can be best explained by reference to an intelligent agent. The difference between our argument and the Paley argument is that his argument is based on similarity of two effects, whereas we're able to characterize the effect in question, and therefore we can characterize the information present in DNA and show that it's identical to information in other systems, the origin of which we know. So we can develop knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world based on independent observation of the origin of that same type of effect. And so we have an identity of effects. We don't have to depend for the force of the argument on a subjective assessment of similarity of effects. And therefore, the argument is not formally an argument from analogy, but actually an inference to the best explanation of the same type of effect, which can be characterized with precision. This is, again, a somewhat technical, philosophical, and scientific discussion, which I have developed at some length in chapter 17 of Signature in the Cell, a chapter where I address a number of common objections to the design argument, one of which, isn't this just a replay of William Paley? Well, it's not. I think Paley is undersold, as I said. I think the argument is stronger than people realize, because I don't think Darwin refuted it. But nevertheless, I think there's a stronger form of the design argument, and we develop it based on the information-bearing properties, not mere subjective assessments of similarity.
Regarding what you just said, I think it was Bertrand Russell who said about on Salem argument about the existence of God, that it is much easier to laugh at the argument than to point to the exact point in the argument where it is false. Because if you read it, or when you read it, you say, okay, this is a very stupid argument, but okay, where exactly does it false? And it is very hard. You talked about chapter 17 in Signature in the Cell. I want to go to chapter 20 in The Return of the God Hypothesis, sure, titled Acts of God or God of the Gaps. Now, you addressed this question just before, but I want, if you can please elaborate. The idea of God of Gaps, that if we don't know something about the scientific world, we can do two things. One is to say we don't know. Yes, in the modern era, they, for the first time, when they drew the maps of the world, where they didn't know, they just say we don't know, and they didn't, invented mythological creatures. But we can say, this is God. This is where God intervene. But the problem is, and this is a very serious problem for in Orthodox Judaism, when you put God, when you use God, when you don't know something about science, whenever science discover this or close the gap, you can take God away. So if you use God as someone who can, close all the gaps, be aware, be prepared that someday, this gap will be closed. So my question is, you always refer to this is the best explanation possible, but maybe we can come up sooner or later with a different materialistic explanation, which reduces to what we just said, or the work that you just did is basically the God of the gaps. So how do you address this question?
Right. Well, God of the gaps is a shorthand way of asserting that the argument for intelligent design is committing the informal logical fallacy of an argument from ignorance. And arguments of those types have the following logical form. Cause A is, we now know, insufficient to produce effect X. Therefore, cause B did it, without offering any independent evidence that cause B is sufficient to produce cause X or was present to produce cause X. So it's critiquing one hypothesis or a causal explanation, and then inferring without any evidence that another is better or sufficient or adequate. That's not how we're arguing. It's not how I'm arguing. In the case of in Signature in the Cell, when I'm making the case for intelligent design, I show that chance, physical chemical necessity, and the combination of the two hypotheses of each of those three, as it happens, exhaustive set of possible materialistic explanations, all fail for empirical and theoretical reasons. But then I say, but then I show that there is another cause, another possible cause that we could consider, and we have positive evidence of the causal efficacy of that positive of that other causal possibility, and further that because there is only one known cause of the origin of functionally specified digital information, and that cause is intelligence. When we see evidence of that cause or of that effect, we can infer back to that only known cause. When there's only one known cause, you can establish both the causal adequacy and the causal existence, or the existence of the cause from the effect itself. If it's the case that where there's smoke, there's fire, if I see smoke wafting up over a distant hillside, I can infer that there's fire below simply because I know that there's only one known cause of smoke, and that's fire. And so this is not an argument from ignorance. This is an argument from our knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world, of what it takes to generate functionally specified digital information.
Just a second, because we are very short on time. So
yes, sorry.
Okay. No. This is great. But what you just say, I couldn't agree more. But this is not an evidence. This is a plausible. This is an argument, and I will even go with you and say this is a very plausible argument. This is a great argument. Okay, but just like you said, up until now, with the only thing that produce information is intelligence. I'm absolutely 100% with you. But what if in the big universe we find something else? It's like the black swan theory, or usually smoke comes, fire creates smoke, but maybe one day we find smoke that doesn't come out of fire. And so basically what you just say is that you're presenting a very good, plausible argument. Would you consider this an argument, or no, this is an evidence?
Well, it's an argument based on evidence, or it's an inference based on evidence. But remember, we've also been accused of not being scientific.
What is the falsifies of intelligent design?
Well, let's set aside falsification, because that's a red herring, which I can come back to. But the point is, what you're saying is that it's not a proof, right? In the sense of an absolute certainty, because all scientific inferences have to are provisional based on the knowledge that we have of the effect in question and the cause and effect structure of the world at present. And so in formulating the evidence for the argument for intelligent design, I formulated it as a provisional scientific inference, as all scientific inferences are. So we have our critics who say, on the one hand, well, it's not a proof, but then they turn around and say, well, it's not scientific. Well, it is scientific precisely because it's not a proof. Science doesn't provide proofs. Now, I think there are some very good in principle reasons to reject those alternative materialistic approaches. Prebiotic selection, natural selection, begs the question. It is begging the question of the very thing it's trying to explain, namely an information-rich molecule. The theories based on physical chemical necessity fail to understand that information is different than order, than regularity. Physical chemical laws, by definition, describe patterns of repeating order, not information. So that's exactly the wrong kind of explanation to pursue. And the chance explanation we've already kind of explained. So all three of these things have not just slight empirical inadequacies, they have fundamental theoretical deficiencies that make them unlikely to render a better type of explanation later. But with that stated, we have to always be open to the possibility that, well, maybe something better will come along, or maybe something as good. We may end up with a situation where we have two equally good explanations, one based on intelligence and maybe some materialistic explanation comes along, then we would have two good explanations that wouldn't necessarily refute the ID approach. But right now, ID is, I think, decisively superior. Intelligent design is decisively superior to any materialistic explanation, and for both empirical and fundamental theoretical reasons that lead me to suspect it's unlikely to be overturned as the best explanation. But it is provisional in the logical structure that's been used to develop it, and that's one of the things that makes it properly scientific. We're not presenting a deductively certain proof from self-evident axioms, as you might do in mathematics.
Because this is a scientific method, which leads me to my unfortunately last question today with you. Okay, so again, this is very important. It's not that like the Occam razor, that the materialistic world has no extra argument or hypothesis that they use in intelligent design have. It's nothing is 100% not 100 sure for intelligent design, nor the materialistic world, which leads me to my last question. It seems that nothing can change the mind of His Holiness Dawkins, just nothing. And which many people, I think it was Roger Scruton, said that this is a religion. He is a fanatic religious person. And my question is, can you propose an experiment that if goes in one way, you say, I think that we made a mistake. Can you propose a falsifiable experiment for intelligent design?
Two quick points. One is that falsification as an idea that determines scientific status has fallen into some disfavor among people who study the methods of science, which are the philosophers of science. And that's because falsification presupposes that theories are confirmed or disconfirmed by single predictions that either come true or don't. And it's very rarely that simple. That rather one tests an idea by comparing it against a preponderance, by looking at the preponderance of data and looking at both the explanatory power of the hypothesis and its ability to predict new data. And so intelligent design is exactly that kind of hypothesis. It explains a lot of facts we already knew, and it has made predictions about things that have come true that were unexpected. For example, that the information, or that rather the so-called junk DNA would turn out to be importantly functional rather than junk, as the Darwinists were predicting. And so, yes, there are actually many and judged in that way, the appropriate way to judge a theory. I generate in the epilogue of Signature in the Cell 10 different ID-based predictions about the natural world, and some of them have already been tested and found and been confirmed. And there are others that await to be tested. So ID is very testable in three ways. It can be tested against our knowledge of cause and effect. It can be tested against against facts that we already have about living cells or the structure of animal life or the fossil record, for example. And it can be tested by the predictions that it makes about facts that have yet to be assessed or determined or observed. So it is eminently testable in the way any good scientific hypothesis should be. As for Dawkins, I want to just raise something. I appreciate him because of the clarity with which he defines issues. And he has a wonderful quotation in which he says that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And I love that framing, because what he's showing is that a metaphysical hypothesis, his hypothesis of scientific materialism, which is what he means by blind, pitiless indifference, that everything arose by undirected material processes, is testable against by making observations about the properties of the universe. And what I show in the most recent book, Return of the God Hypothesis, is there are three really important properties that the universe possesses that are precisely what you would not expect based on Dawkins's scientific atheism or scientific materialism. First of all, that the physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy, as best we can tell from multiple lines of evidence and from developments in theoretical physics, had a definite beginning. The materialists have always affirmed that the thing from which everything else came, the matter and energy, is matter and energy, that there is the matter and energy are eternal and self-existent. That has not turned out to be the case. Matter and energy appear to have had a beginning. Secondly, the universe from the beginning has been finely tuned against all odds to make life possible. This is not expected and was not expected on a materialist view. In order to account for that, the materialists have had to come up with elaborate ad hoc hypotheses such as the multiverse. But then it turns out that the universe generating mechanisms that are necessary to make the multiverse work are themselves require prior fine-tuning. So fine-tuning is not expected or well explained on the materialistic hypothesis of Dawkins. And then finally, the digital code and the information-bearing properties of DNA are quite surprising from a materialistic perspective, given our knowledge that it takes someone to code. You need a programmer to generate programming or code. This is not expected. And Dawkins himself has acknowledged this in a tweet just 2 summers ago. He admitted to being knocked sideways with wonder at the information processing system inside the cell, which had been recently animated by an Australian group. So I really appreciate the way Dawkins frames the issue. His framing implies that the metaphysical hypothesis of scientific materialism is testable. And what I've argued in my most recent book is that it's testable and it has been found wanting, whereas intelligent design and even the idea of a theistic designer is also testable because it generates certain expectations about what you would see in the universe. And those expectations have been confirmed by our most surprising scientific findings of the 20th century.
Wow, this was just too short. I have nothing else to say. Steve Meyer, I promised you 1 hour and I want to keep my promise. Thank you so much for your time and effort in your great books. I think that we must do like a second half for this great conversation. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Roy, yes, and for coming so well prepared and for such a stimulating discussion. Let's do it again. This is great.
This is great. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Shalom. Shalom.
On this channel, you will see the authors of these books and many more having great conversations with me. Please subscribe, hit the bell button, and be part of this great community. See you in the next video.